It was just another day, or it ought to have been. It was a bright Wednesday morning on November 4th, 2010. Feeling the enthusiasm, hopes, and ambitions that accompany every voyage, hundreds of passengers boarded Qantas Flight 32. A ticking time bomb, however, was concealed somewhere in the mechanics of the enormous Airbus A380, poised to detonate one of the most horrifying, chaotic incidents in aviation history. They didn't know it yet, but just seconds into their journey, they were already on a countdown to disaster. What would soon follow was a fight against time, fate, and the impossible. Only one question loomed. Could they prevent the catastrophe that seemed inevitable? The journey for the passengers on Qantas Flight 32 started off like most long-haul flights do. A huge Airbus A380, an engineering marvel of the contemporary day, took to the skies. Experienced and reliable, the pilots exuded confidence. In blissful ignorance, they settled in for the lengthy journey from Singapore to Sydney. During their flight over Indonesia, they were either absorbed in their latest films or dozing off. It was safe, expected, and normal. But then came the first crack in the illusion of safety. At 7,000 feet above the ground, with no sign of trouble, a faint tremor moved through the aircraft, barely noticeable, but felt by those most in tune with the machine. One passenger, a frequent flyer, noted a slight vibration but dismissed it. After all, this was an Airbus A380, one of the safest and most advanced aircraft in the skies. What they didn't know was that something critical had already gone catastrophically wrong. In the cockpit, everything seemed routine until it wasn't. At 7,400 feet, just minutes after takeoff, the left wing engine erupted with a violent explosion, sending metal fragments flying through the plane's wing and fuselage. The cockpit erupted into chaos as dozens of alarms began blaring. The pilots were now faced with not one, not two, but over 100 system alerts flashing in front of them. This wasn't just an engine failure. This was a full-blown crisis. Imagine the sinking feeling in the pit of their stomachs as the realization set in. This was no minor issue. The engine, a Rolls-Royce Trent 900, one of the most reliable and trusted engines in the world, had suffered an uncontained engine failure, a rare but deadly event where fragments from the engine burst through its casing, tearing into the wing like shrapnel. The pilots in the cockpit had to deal with a storm of lights and noises as one alert after another arose, each requiring immediate action. Although they had received training on emergency landings, hydraulic problems, and even engine difficulty, nothing had prepared them for the mayhem that was taking place right in front of them. There was more than one engine malfunction. The problem had spread throughout the aircraft, causing secondary and even third-level systems to malfunction in ways that were not covered by any handbook or checklist. A network of interconnected systems makes up the Airbus A380, a true giant of the sky, and is intended to ensure the safety of every flight. With backups for practically every component, it is robustly constructed, guaranteeing that a single issue won't escalate into a more serious one. However, no one anticipated how an unforeseen engine problem would impact those backups. Hydraulic systems, responsible for controlling the plane's surfaces, brakes, and landing gear, began to fail. With the hydraulic systems compromised, controlling the aircraft became exponentially more difficult. Steering the A380, especially with one engine out, demanded precision, but every action taken now had an impact somewhere else on the plane. The fuel transfer system, which shifts fuel between tanks to balance weight and ensure optimal performance, was also impacted. Fuel was leaking from the wing, creating an imbalance in weight distribution and forcing the pilots to continuously adjust to keep the plane level. With the fuel transfer system malfunctioning, the imbalance grew more dangerous by the second. And to make matters worse, the fuel leak brought the constant threat of fire. as fuel seeped dangerously close to overheated components and electrical systems. Then came the electrical issues. The pilots were left without essential information and equipment to properly steer the aircraft when the electrical systems began to flicker. While losing a single instrument can complicate a flight, they were abruptly without many displays and diagnostic tools due to the grid's intermittent outages. Because screens flickered on and off and occasionally displayed incorrect data, it was nearly impossible to distinguish between a glitch and a true problem. One electrical loss at a moment, it seemed like the A380 was becoming more and more out of their control. The pilots of Qantas Flight 32 found themselves thrust into a high-stakes situation where every passing second demanded quick, decisive action. The margin for error was non-existent, and their every move required absolute precision. In the chaos of failing systems, they had to make split-second decisions, weighing the consequences of each action before it even happened. They were not merely reacting, they were thinking several moves ahead, forced to anticipate the ripple effects of every switch they touched, every dial they turned, every system they adjusted. This was a level of problem-solving that went beyond conventional emergency procedures. It was a test of their ability to stay calm, think creatively, and manage one of the most complex crises imaginable. But in a situation like this, where one wrong move could lead to catastrophe, the stakes were terrifyingly high. Each choice they made held the potential to either bring them closer to safety or plunge them further into disaster. They weren't just dealing with a singular failure. They were battling a web of interlocking issues, where each malfunction seemed to trigger new complications. Each attempt at control seemed to reveal another layer of instability. It was as if they were walking on a razor-thin tightrope, balancing on the edge of a precipice, where one miscalculated step could send them spiraling into chaos. Every adjustment, every command input had to be meticulously planned. There was no room for guesswork, no margin for uncertainty. They had to consider all the potential outcomes of each action, playing out various scenarios in their minds, even as alarms blared and systems failed around them. The level of concentration required was immense, and yet they had no choice but to stay sharp. The lives of 469 people depended on it. They were operating under unimaginable pressure, and they knew that time was not on their side. With every passing second, their options dwindled, and the situation grew more precarious. Their hands moved almost instinctively across the controls, tempered by years of training, experience, and an unwavering focus. But even with all their skill, they were up against an enemy they could barely keep up with, a constantly evolving crisis where every solution seemed to create new problems. They were managing not just the physical mechanics of the aircraft, but also the psychological demands of such an intense situation. Every decision was a mental battle, requiring them to keep their fear at bay, maintain control over their thoughts, and focus on the immediate need for survival. Each choice they made carried with it a weight of responsibility that was both immediate and profound. They were aware that every minor adjustment could impact the entire aircraft. The complexity of the situation required them to compartmentalize each problem while keeping a broader perspective, thinking simultaneously in the present moment and several steps ahead. This dual focus, solving the immediate issue while anticipating the next potential failure, was exhausting, yet it was the only way to keep the plane in the air long enough to attempt a safe landing. Time was slipping through their fingers, a relentless adversary that gave them no respite. The pressure to act quickly, paired with the need for absolute precision, was overwhelming. Yet, the pilots of Qantas Flight 32 pressed forward, navigating a path through chaos with a resilience that few could ever imagine, let alone embody in a moment of crisis. Many passengers in the cabin were confused and terrified by the blast. The air was heavy with the pungent stench of burning fuel, and those seated close to the wing could see smoke streaming from the damaged engine. Where there had once been quiet moments, they now exchanged silent murmurs and worried looks with one another. Despite their training to maintain composure, the cabin crew was visibly uncomfortable as they attempted to calm passengers while also controlling their own anxieties. They knew better than anyone how devastating an engine issue like this could be. This was not just turbulence. This was not a rough patch. This was a crisis of a magnitude few planes and few pilots ever face. As the plane continued to soar, the pilots tried to assess the damage, but every attempt to control the failing systems seemed to trigger new alarms, new problems. The aircraft's computer systems were working overtime, desperately rerouting power, fuel, and controls wherever possible. But there were limits to what even a sophisticated machine like the A380 could handle. More alerts began popping up: hydraulic leaks, fuel leaks, engine fires. Even the most experienced pilots would be put to the test if they had to deal with just one major problem. However, this was not the only issue facing the crew of Qantas Flight 32. A constant series of problems, each more severe than the previous, faced them. The airplane seemed to be on the verge of collapse as a result of a spiraling web of malfunctions that affected every major system. On their own, hydraulic leaks, broken gasoline lines, and engine problems could have proved catastrophic. When combined, they created a storm that appeared intent on pushing them to the edge. With each passing second, the situation became increasingly dire. Every fix, every attempt to stabilize the craft was met with yet another failure, yet another alarm demanding their attention. The complexity of the Airbus A380, typically an asset with its layered redundancies and advanced technology, now became a near insurmountable obstacle. Instead of responding predictably, the systems they had relied on seemed to rebel, refusing to follow the usual procedures or offer the stability they so desperately needed. It was as though the very machinery they had trusted, machinery designed to be their greatest ally in the sky, had turned against them, morphing into an unpredictable, hostile force. Every switch they flicked, every knob they adjusted, seemed to yield diminishing returns. The plane systems, normally engineered to ensure safety, seemed almost intent on thwarting every attempt to regain control. The cockpit was no longer a command center. It had become a battleground against a machine that seemed determined to resist them at every turn. In moments of extreme crisis, the human brain undergoes a remarkable transformation, narrowing its focus, heightening awareness, and honing in on the immediate need to survive. For the pilots of Qantas Flight 32, the urgency of the situation was all-consuming. The cockpit's overwhelming flood of alarms, flashing lights, and wailing sirens blended into a sensory storm. Yet their minds had already shifted gears, suppressing the instinctive fear that might paralyze others in their position. They could not afford hesitation. They understood that with every passing second, their choices would dictate not only their fate, but also that of every single passenger and crew member on board. The fire and fuel leak from the engine posed an enormous threat, and the damaged engine had to be shut down to prevent further catastrophe. But it was a delicate operation. Turning off the engine outright meant isolating a portion of the A380's intricate network of controls, hydraulics, and electrical power, all interconnected in ways that made deactivating even one part risky. Severing the engine's link to the rest of the aircraft meant potentially disrupting other critical systems that were already hanging by a thread. Yet, the fire spreading from the engine was a ticking bomb that could escalate rapidly if not brought under control. In that moment, every decision felt like walking a tightrope stretched across a chasm. It was a calculated gamble, and each choice bore tremendous consequences. The weight on the pilot's shoulders was profound. They weren't just fighting for control of a machine, but for the lives of 469 people who were entirely reliant on their ability to keep the plane from spiraling into disaster. Back in the cabin, passengers were beginning to realize the severity of the situation. Flight attendants were trying to remain calm, but as they checked the emergency equipment, it became clear to everyone that this was no ordinary event. The anxiety in the cabin was palpable. Some passengers were praying, others crying, clutching their loved ones. And above all, a question haunted everyone. Would they survive? Once a representation of accuracy and steadiness, the powerful Airbus A380 was suddenly becoming a beast in the skies, defying the pilot's best attempts to maintain its equilibrium. Important wing components were jeopardized due to the substantial damage to the left wing engine, which put the aircraft in a risky, unbalanced condition. Losing power wasn't the only issue. The entire airplane was unsteady, seemingly resisting their every action. The pilots were constantly reminded of the invisible damage beneath the surface of the wing by the left sides dragging and trembling under the load. The longer they stayed in the air, the less control they seemed to have. The altitude fluctuated unexpectedly. Each attempt to stabilize met with an unsettling unpredictability that threatened to push the plane into a downward spiral. The pilot and co-pilot exchanged tense glances, aware that they were running out of options and time. Altering the flight path became their only strategy to survive. The goal now was to bring the aircraft down in one piece. Every mile closer to the ground was both a step closer to safety and a reminder of the impending difficulty they faced. The A380, designed to glide with grace and efficiency, now lumbered through the air like a wounded animal struggling to reach safe ground. Landing was no longer an option but a necessity, and the challenges that lay ahead were staggering. Bringing down a fully loaded Airbus A380, with its immense weight and now impaired wing structure, required precision bordering on perfection. However, precision was exactly what the failing systems denied them. The analogy was fitting. Attempting to land this colossal machine, which was barely responding to their commands, was akin to maneuvering a double-decker bus across a patch of slick ice. They would need to find the narrow path between catastrophe and safety, delicately balancing power and control, while the odds seemed stacked overwhelmingly against them. The pilots of Qantas Flight 32 knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that their only option was to make an emergency landing back in Singapore. There was simply no alternative. The damage sustained by the aircraft was far too severe to continue any further, and each mile flown meant venturing deeper into the unknown, risking more lives. But they were all too aware that the path back to the ground was fraught with its own dangers. Every aspect of this landing would have to be executed with near-perfect precision. The stakes were too high for any mistakes. The smallest miscalculation, the slightest oversight, could cascade into disaster, transforming an already critical situation into something catastrophic. Fuel was leaking from the damaged left wing, streaming out at an alarming rate. This was not just a logistical problem, but an ever-present threat hanging over them like a sword, as every drop that spilled from the wing brought them closer to the edge of safety. This leak meant that as they burned fuel for the return, their reserves dwindled rapidly, reducing both their options and time. It was a race not just against fuel levels, but against fate itself. And as if that wasn't enough, the very real risk of fire loomed in the back of their minds. The damaged engine and exposed wiring created the perfect conditions for an onboard blaze, a potential disaster that could ignite at any moment. They knew that if a fire broke out in the weakened wing, there would be little they could do to control it, and it would spread swiftly, likely compromising the entire structure of the aircraft. Then there was the engine. One of the 4 engines, a critical component of the A380's flight capabilities, was completely shut down. This was not merely an inconvenience, it significantly reduced the power and stability of the plane, making it far more difficult to control. Losing an engine fundamentally altered the dynamics of the A380, an aircraft whose massive weight demands an immense amount of thrust to maintain stability and respond to the pilot's commands. The imbalance created by the inactive engine was felt in every maneuver, every turn. The plane no longer responded with the smooth precision the pilots were used to. Instead, it reacted sluggishly, its movements burdened by the loss of power and control on one side. And while the A380 is designed with redundancies to handle many types of emergencies, a full engine shutdown coupled with structural damage put it in a league of its own. It would seem impossible to land an A380 in these conditions on any given day. This is the kind of worst-case situation that no pilot ever expects to face in real life. However, today was anything but typical. The systems they usually relied on were either inoperable or barely functioning. Controls were slow or unresponsive, instruments flashed in and out, and even the plane's computers appeared to be struggling to handle so many problems at once. The pilots were fighting not just to bring the plane down safely, but to retain even the most basic command over the wounded aircraft. As they drew closer to Singapore, their minds raced through every possible outcome, every conceivable hazard. They had to think far ahead, anticipating how the aircraft would react during descent and how the damaged wing and compromised fuel system would influence their landing. This wasn't just a matter of skill, it was about precision, about maintaining calm in a storm of unknowns. They reviewed every detail in their minds: how to angle the plane, how much thrust to apply, the best possible approach path, knowing that even the tiniest misstep would have cascading consequences. In an emergency of this scale, each decision wasn't just a choice, but a calculated gamble. Every second of flight, every degree of descent brought them closer to both the ground and to potential disaster. Then came the issue of the landing itself. Bringing an Airbus A380 down is no small feat, even in the best of conditions. But here, they were facing something altogether different. Landing an aircraft of this size requires precise timing, a delicate balance between speed and angle, and an acute awareness of every element impacting the plane's structure. They needed to reduce their speed to safely touch down but couldn't risk stalling, which could send the plane spiraling out of control in the critical moments before landing. The weight distribution was another major problem. With one engine inactive and fuel leaking from one side, the aircraft's balance was off, making it prone to tilting or veering, potentially destabilizing the landing altogether. It was like trying to bring a massive wounded bird to rest without knowing if it could still respond to its own instincts to glide and settle. And beyond the technical demands, the emotional strain on the pilots was immense. The lives of 469 people were in their hands, and the burden of that responsibility bore down heavily. They could feel the tension in every nerve, every breath. It wasn't just an emergency. It was a moment that required everything they had: focus, courage, experience, and a steely resolve to do what seemed nearly impossible. They couldn't afford to think about the what-ifs, the countless ways things could go wrong. They pushed those thoughts aside, focusing only on what needed to be done. As they began their descent, the air around them thickened with anticipation. The passengers, unaware of the full extent of the damage, sensed the tension in the cabin, the unspoken urgency. The crew, too, remained silent, their faces reflecting the gravity of the situation. The final approach was nerve-wracking, each foot of descent adding to the pressure. The pilots kept an eye out for any indication of problems, observing every slight movement and flicker. They could just feel the pull of the ground as they got closer to the runway. So close, but so dangerous. They realized they had achieved the pinnacle of this experience as they prepared for touchdown in the last second. They maneuvered the A380 down with all of their concentration, every nerve alerted to the slightest change, and they felt a flood of relief as the wheels hit the runway, relieving the tension that had been building for hours. They had succeeded. They had successfully returned Qantas Flight 32 to the ground in spite of all the difficulties and dangers. As they prepared for descent, they had to jettison fuel to lighten the plane, standard procedure in emergencies. But with the damaged systems, even dumping fuel became a hazard. The controls were unstable, the feedback unreliable. Every adjustment felt like a roll of the dice, and every second in the air was a second closer to potential disaster. As they approached the runway, an eerie silence fell over the cabin. The chatter, the murmurs, the rustling, everything was gone, replaced by a collective, almost sacred quiet. Every passenger held their breath, feeling the weight of the moment. It was a life or death situation. A single heartbeat stretched across the entire cabin. The tension was palpable, filling every inch of space as hundreds of minds were gripped by the same thought. Would they make it? In the cockpit, the pilots were running on nothing but pure focus and the remnants of their adrenaline. They were exhausted, physically and mentally drained from the relentless battle they had fought to bring the aircraft to this point. Yet, in those critical moments, their minds were sharpened, laser-focused on one thing: guiding the battered, unresponsive aircraft toward the ground, toward safety. They had come so far, yet even now, the final moments demanded their absolute best. As the aircraft descended, every slight fluctuation, every tilt, every unsettling jolt was a stark reminder of the peril that hung over them. The left wing, weakened by the engine failure, seemed to fight against the descent, adding to the unpredictability of each second. Every adjustment to the controls felt like wrestling with a force that could, at any moment, spiral out of control. The runway loomed closer, yet it felt agonizingly distant. The ground was their salvation, yet reaching it seemed like an endless trial. The cabin remained silent, every passenger and crew member frozen in their seats, clinging to hope as the plane descended. It was a collective moment of faith in the pilots, in the aircraft, and perhaps even in something beyond them all. Then, in those final seconds, the pilots summoned every last ounce of skill, every last bit of concentration. With a precise, desperate maneuver, they aligned the aircraft for the touchdown. The wheels made contact with the runway, and the cabin jolted as the massive plane connected with the ground. They had done it. The plane had touched down. A collective gasp echoed through the cabin as the plane finally screeched to a halt. They had done it. Despite all odds, the pilots of Qantas Flight 32 managed to safely return the damaged aircraft to the ground, despite the constant storm of malfunctioning equipment and the tremendous pressure they were under. In a situation where every factor seemed set against them, where each decision teetered on the edge of catastrophe, they had held their ground, stayed resolute, and pulled off a landing that defied all logic and expectation. As the wheels touched down and the aircraft finally rolled to a stop, a wave of emotion surged through the cabin. The passengers, who had been sitting in tense, fearful silence, suddenly erupted. Applause filled the air, echoing from every corner of the plane. The sounds of clapping, mixed with relieved, unrestrained cries, resonated through the cabin as tears flowed freely down the faces of those who, only moments before, had feared they would never see solid ground again. They had been inches from the abyss, staring down the worst, only to emerge, shaken, but alive. This wasn't just relief. It was the profound gratitude of people who had stared death in the face and somehow been given a second chance. They had come face to face with disaster, with fear clawing at their hearts and hope flickering like a faint light. Yet, despite everything, despite the wreckage of their faith in technology, in certainty, and in safety, they had survived. They had lived through the unimaginable, and each and every one of them now had a story of survival, a story of courage, a story of how, when everything fell apart, their lives had been saved by a crew who defied fate itself. But the question remains, what went wrong? The investigation that followed revealed a flaw in the Rolls-Royce engine, a defect in an oil pipe that caused it to fracture, leading to the catastrophic failure. This hidden flaw had set off a chain reaction, compromising the aircraft in ways even the best engineers could not have predicted. Qantas Flight 32 stands as a haunting testament to the fragility of human plans, even those grounded in the most advanced technology and meticulous preparation. In aviation, just as in life, the careful strategies, engineered redundancies, and stringent safety protocols can only go so far. An unexpected chain of events can unravel the best-laid plans in the blink of an eye, revealing the inherent unpredictability of the world we navigate. This incident reminds us that no amount of planning can fully eliminate risk or guarantee smooth outcomes. Despite years of design, testing, and experience, there are always elements beyond our control, elements that lurk beneath the surface and strike when least expected. In moments like these, where the machinery and technology designed to protect us falter, we are left with something far more fundamental: human resilience. When the systems fail, it's the sheer grit, quick thinking, and unwavering resolve of individuals that stand between catastrophe and survival. This resilience isn't just about technical skill. It's about the deep-seated determination to face fear, to overcome the odds, and to make split-second decisions under extraordinary pressure. It's the ability to keep a steady hand and clear mind, even when surrounded by chaos. The courage displayed in such moments transcends mere bravery. It's the courage to acknowledge the situation's gravity while refusing to be overwhelmed by it. For the crew of Qantas Flight 32, courage wasn't just an abstract concept. It was a palpable force that drove them to act, to manage, to adapt. In the face of overwhelming odds, they found the strength to confront their worst fears and press forward with resolve, placing their own fears aside to protect those in their care. This courage is what transforms a crisis into a fight for survival, giving strength to others and bringing hope even when all seems lost. Yet courage alone isn't enough without expertise. Moments like these reveal the vital importance of experience and training, of years spent honing skills that might one day be the difference between life and death. For the pilots of Qantas Flight 32, their expertise became a guiding light, grounding them amidst the swirling uncertainties and technical failures. Expertise enabled them to make decisions that went beyond textbooks and manuals, relying on a wealth of information accumulated over innumerable hours in the cockpit, and to comprehend the limitations and potential of their compromised aircraft. Qantas Flight 32 stands as a testament to the qualities that define us at our best: our resilience, our courage, and our expertise. It serves as a reminder that although technology is capable of amazing feats, human strength is what eventually triumphs. The ability to adapt, the bravery to meet danger head-on, and the knowledge to make wise decisions are what give one the chance to survive when faced with the unexpected. When everything else fails, the human spirit triumphs, turning even the most horrific obstacles into tales of perseverance and hope.